Finally getting used to these masks. The only issue is what we call beard mask. Puts a little crease in there for us. Well, good morning. I have to admit, last couple of weeks have been kind of difficult. A little bit of a challenge for me personally, as well for obviously our nation nationally, right? And it is good to be back. Hopefully you noticed I wasn't here for the last couple of weeks. But for the most part, I've left kind of the reason for my absence somewhat quiet. And I'm kind of that guy who doesn't like a whole lot of attention. I also don't like a lot of people to worry. But I did come down with COVID. And gratefully, my family was spared. Our biggest concern during this entire pandemic has been keeping our youngest safe, as well as, of course, my oldest and my wife. But my youngest is considered, as many of you know, high risk. So we're very, very pleased to say that the rest of the family was spared. And even though I had some mild symptoms, and even as I sit here today, there's some of those symptoms are still kind of lingering a bit. The hardest thing for me during that time was actually the isolation period. As many of you can possibly, and I'm sure I can imagine, being apart and away from your family for a period of time is not easy. Especially in my house, which is fairly small, you can hear almost everything that goes on in there. So hearing my kids laughing and playing and hearing my wife's voice and all of those things were kind of difficult to deal with. And knowing I couldn't do anything to assist when my youngest or my oldest got upset. So I got to say that was probably the hardest part that I had to deal with over these past couple of weeks is just that isolation period. So it's really good to be back and be able to hold my girls in my arms again. And as I'm standing back too, and I know I'm not the only one who has been impacted by this isolation, right? This isolation from others during this pandemic. But I also recognize, and I think it's prudent for us to recognize that the nation and what we're going through, that has also had the impact to a lot of people of isolation. Right? There's a lot of people who feel isolated by what's going on in our country as well. And I think it's fair to say, too, that probably the two darkest clouds that are over in the skies of our nation right now is this pandemic and, of course, this national and political unrest that we see in our country. Politically, we see this unrest with the left versus the right. We see the Trump supporters versus mainstream media and big tech. I'm sure you've seen that all over. We see racial tension inside of our country and within our walls of our country. I put that in the bucket of political because really if you stand back and look at it from 10,000 feet above the air, look at the two sides and how they respond to some of this unrest. There's definitely, at least in part, there's some political implications there. And then, of course, just a few days ago, I'm sure many of us saw the news that our President Trump was impeached. This time for the second time, which was a milestone in our country's history. And during that time, 10 House Republicans voted yes to impeach Donald J. Trump, which is unprecedented in our country. This just paints a simple picture for us to see that our country is divided. Our country's divided, and really these are the times where we really do see who our true friends are. We really do see who are the ones who love us unconditionally and who love us sacrificially. These are the times where we really know who's going to truly be there for you in those times of need. So as we continue this morning in our series that we're calling Never Turning Back or Never Going Back, I hope that we can address this and hopefully be encouraged by it through the story we'll read today. So if you are joining us for the first time in this series, what we're really trying to do is explore some issues that can cause us to get trapped in the past and not move forward in the way that God is desiring us to do so. And that's really what we're hoping to accomplish during this series as we start the year. So one of these things is the trap of is settling for what we're going to call today superficial relationships. Settling for superficial relationships. So we're going to do that today by looking at a book called Ruth. Now, go ahead and find it now. It's one of those small books that's kind of hard to find. It's right in between Judges and 1 Samuel, towards the front of your Bibles in the Old Testament. But this is a small book of Ruth. We're going to look at the first chapter. We'll look at an overview of the rest of it, but we'll look at mostly the first chapter today. So as you're there, let's go ahead and start reading in verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and the man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he, his wife, and his 2 sons. The name of that man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of his children were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites, I knew I was going to butcher that word, from Bethlehem in Judah, and they went to the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These 2 took Moabite wives. One of the names of the wife was Orpah, and the other one was Ruth. And they lived there for about 10 years. And both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Now, a couple observations as we move forward. Now, at the end of Judges, which preceded this book, we see these words at the very end, these very last verse and chapter. It says that essentially it tells us that there was unrest in the land, right? It tells us there was unrest. Tells us that there were no kings in that land. So everybody kind of did what they wanted to do. And in Ruth 1:1 helps us to see that this was in that same exact time frame of the book of Judges. So we can kind of have some context there of what was going on during that time. So and the second thing that we notice is Naomi was plagued with trials. We see that almost on 5 verses in, we see all this happen to her in her life. So immediately her husband dies. But prior to that, there was a famine in the land, and they had to leave. Right? So they had to leave their home to go to Moab. Now, if you're not familiar with Moab, historically it's not an ally of Israel. In fact, its very existence reveals this stain in the history of Israel. If you're interested in seeing what that is, go back to Genesis 19 and 30, verses 30 through 38. And then later we also see that Isaiah the prophet uses 2 entire chapters 15 and 16, to put these oracles and these woes upon Moab. Later, Jeremiah in chapter 48 of his prophecy does the same thing. But really all this to say is this famine would have been really, really bad for them to have to leave the comfort of their own home to go and sojourn to a nation that was historically in Israel, an enemy to Israel. The language here is interesting too. When you really dig into the word remain there, that term, that phrase that's used in verse 2, it actually implies that they were going to stay there indefinitely. There were really no plans to go back. It kind of reminded me when I showed up in Tucson in 2009. At the end of the day, I didn't have any plans to stay here, right? It was kind of a journey and a stop along the way. But here we are 11 years later, and I'm still here. So we see that God had plans, at least in my life, and what we'll see as we uncover this story, that God had plans with Naomi and her family as well. And of course, if the famine wasn't enough to deal with hunger and this unknown circumstances that would follow, the famine wasn't enough, her husband dies. And then in verse 5, we see that 10 years later, her sons die, and she was left without grandchildren. So now she had no husband, no children, no grandchildren. And that was a big deal for Israelite women in that time. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like going forward. And what I'll do is I'll give you the main idea for today, and then we'll build into that as we move forward. Our main idea today is this: settling for superficial relationships will never be a substitute for sacrificial relationships. Settling for superficial relationships will never be a substitute for sacrificial relationships. So let's pick back up in verse 6, and we'll explore this just a little bit more. Verse 6 reads this: And she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and had given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on to return to the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that you might find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. And then she had kissed them, and she had lifted up their voices, and they wept. And they said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they might become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should stay, say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and shall bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. And then they lifted out their voices and they wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she says, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or return from following you. For wherever you go, I will go. And where you will lodge, I will lodge. And your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you will die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do the same to me, and more also, for if anything but death parts me from you. And then Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, and she said no more. So with this section as a backdrop, I want to kind of discuss something here. And what I want to discuss is really, how do we develop sacrificial relationships? How do we develop a sacrificial relationship? So trying to pull in the context of church community, the first thing I want to share is simply we need to have faith. Okay? So Naomi had a close ear to what was happening in her home country, right? We can see that here in the text. She had a close eye on what was going on, and when she had heard that God provided, she knew it was true because she knew her God, right? So she trusted that the Lord would provide, and she did. So then they returned. But we also see from this narrative that all the circumstances that she was dealing with, they were all temporary, right? So there were temporary circumstances that we mentioned a little bit earlier. And then later what we'll see is that because of Ruth's faithfulness, she was able to find a husband, right? So she went in assuming that she was going to be alone, right? And at least that's some of the implication we see there. And then her husband Boaz, that she later meets, acts as a redeemer. And we'll explore that concept just a bit later as well. And then, of course, we saw that Naomi also ended up with a grandchild. And we see that later in verse 17 of chapter 4 with Obed, who is the father of Jesse, who is the father of David, the king. And then, but because of that, what we see is even though our circumstances are temporary, what we see in regards to relationships is sacrificial relationships are not temporary. Right? See that contrast there. Sacrificial relationships are not temporary. One can argue that Orpah stayed only out of obligation when she did. And then she was really given permission to leave, and that's why she did. And this isn't a dig on Orpah, because frankly, she was really under no obligation to stay. She wasn't under the law. She wasn't an Israelite. In fact, the word kindly that's used in verse 8, it's the same word that's used all throughout the Old Testament to describe love and loyalty and mercy and favor. And she used this word to describe how her daughters treated her, in addition to asking God to give that same treatment to them. Nonetheless, Orpah left. Maybe she knew that being a Moabite in Bethlehem was probably going to be uncomfortable. Maybe she knew that she was not going to be able to put her gods aside and her culture aside and adapt to what Naomi was dealing with. And moreover, her God and worshiping her God. So she decided to return what was comfortable for her. But there was also something special about this relationship that Ruth and Naomi had. And I love what we see in verse 14. The text says that Ruth clung to Naomi. That word clung is the same word that we see back in Genesis 2:24, that word cleave, and it's the same concept there, where it was the description of how Adam and Eve were supposed to be together, right? So there was a special connection with Ruth and her mother-in-law. Orpah could only stay for so long, but Ruth demonstrated her love by clinging to Naomi. And another aspect does require reading into the text just a little bit, and I know Pat warned about that just last week. I'm not ignoring him, I promise. Notice how the loyalty of Ruth was not just restricted to only Naomi. She said, I will go in with your culture and your God, right? So she wanted to be a part of Naomi's life and everything that came with it. So we can really deduct that there had to have been something very special in the life of Naomi that caused Ruth to convert to her faith. We see that later in the New Testament in 1 Peter 3, don't we? Where the idea with living with an unbeliever is to express your love and commitment to that person, right? And just to be Christ in their lives. And that's really what we see here as well. And when we build authentic relationships, right, those sacrificial, authentic relationships, over time, it actually might lead to deeper and more meaningful relationships. And really, if we want to put that in better and more spiritual terms, kingdom relationships. Sometimes these relationships are not always comfortable to start with, and there's bumps along the way. Sometimes you might feel alone while you're on this journey. But when we look to the kingdom, we can overcome these differences in our lives. The third thing that I want to point out is that this passage teaches us that sacrificial relationships require moving forward. Okay, they require moving forward. What we see here is we see Orpah return to her people. Even Naomi returned to her people. But Ruth, she was different. She made the decision to change her direction, didn't she? Naomi complained about her circumstances while Ruth actually embraced her own and her circumstances, that I'm going to run with this, right? And she probably didn't have any idea of why at that point, but she knew that that was what she was called to do. The next thing we see here I want to share is and this is common, but we ought to be very careful that we cannot and we should not blame God for our circumstances. So the next thing we see here is don't blame God for your circumstances. We talked about this a little bit earlier when we contrasted and set this story up in the book of Judges, where we knew that all the people did what was right in their own eyes. If you want to see what a New Testament parallel looks like, go to Romans chapter 1 and 2. It kind of gives you a really clear picture of what that looks like from a New Testament perspective. I actually came across this quote this week that I thought it was relevant for today. Sometimes God's best way to add to your life is to subtract from it. Certain things have to end so better things can begin. Every loss isn't really a loss. I'm sure most of us here in this room were excited to see 2020 go away, right? Everybody had this stigma about 2020 being the worst year ever. But 7 days into it, everybody was looking for a refund, weren't they? I saw this come across some social media quite a few times. I'm done with this trial period. I'm done with it, right? And in this times, if you really think about it, it's difficult to see God at work. It really is. It's really difficult to see God at work. And as Christians, we have to understand and trust that the Lord has a purpose for all of this. And He's not fooled or surprised by what's happening. And I think a lot of people forget that as well. We'll see as we conclude and go into the final steps of this chapter, and we'll see how the rest of this story actually unfolds. So let's go ahead and pick up in verse 19 and finish out this chapter. So the two of them, speaking of Naomi and Ruth, they went out until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" So she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. And I went away full, and the Lord had brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem, at the beginning of the barley harvest. And what's difficult about preaching on just one part of an entire story, and it is difficult, and I don't want to leave anything out, so we'll kind of take a look a little bit of what happens the rest of the story. But first we want to just notice how at the beginning of chapter 1, Naomi left, right? When we get to the end, we see that she had returned, right? So you can really deduct that that's where God wanted her to be. And we also want to take special notice of the of the name change, right? The name change is really important. She tells her kinsman in Bethlehem to call her Mara or Mara, which means bitter, right? She actually explains why as she says it. In contrast, the name Naomi means delight or my delight, right? So this story paints this picture of an emptiness that Naomi felt. And if the story ended after chapter 1, I guess we can probably understand why that would be. But God, right? And I love that statement, but God. I think that's the most powerful statement that we see in the Bible, one of the most powerful statements. God had other plans, didn't he? But God had other plans. God brought back Naomi for a purpose. And not just because they had food again. That was why Naomi went back, but God had a different purpose. But God had a plan for Naomi in his overall story of redemption that we find in the Bible. You see, when things around us are difficult and hard, and they seem to be falling apart all around us, we have to trust that he has you exactly where he wants you to be. Right? So eventually Ruth marries a man named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi. And he is later identified as the Redeemer, or in other translations, the kinsman Redeemer. It's the Hebrew word goel. And it's sometimes translated, like I said, the kinsman Redeemer. And this Redeemer played a very important role. Amongst other things, there are a couple of things here as well. One of them was the responsibility to buy back what the family had been forfeited, right? So when Elimelech died, and they left, something had to have happened with that land so Boaz could actually, as the Redeemer, take that land back. The other one, another area amongst others, is to carry on the family name by marrying a childless widow, right? And there's other laws that come into play here as well. So I hope you see that there, that Boaz played a role here. And God, through Boaz, will restore all that made Naomi Mara, or bitter, right? And this really doesn't cover a theological truth that's within the Bible. So God we see is Israel's Redeemer. God we know is creator, he is deliverer, he is owner, and he owned that piece of promised land. He is the defender, he is king, but again, he's also the Redeemer. And in Hebrews 2:11, Jesus himself is actually identified in part as a kinsman Redeemer. So better stated, Stephanie Van Eyk says this on a website. She says, Boaz foreshadows Jesus Christ as the ultimate redeemer, kinsman redeemer, who will redeem a bride for himself, which is, of course, the church. And another area that I want to uncover is the theme of sacrificial love, right? We're talking about sacrificial relationships. So this idea of sacrificial love. If you really think about it, Ruth gave up everything to be with and stay with Naomi. And we can't ignore that this faithfulness and love is rewarded by God. And we see this later when we read of Boaz and Ruth's offspring. Again, we saw that earlier. They bore a son named Obed. Obed bore a son named Jesse, and Jesse was the father of King David. And this significant connection is also found in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1. And it really all started with this act of sacrificial love. Old Testament Studies professor Robert Chisholm Jr. says this. He says, the sacrificial love displayed in the book foreshadows Christ's supreme act of sacrificial life. It foreshadows Christ's sacrificial love. And we know this too because Jesus displayed love like nobody else could. And we see a small taste of that here in the book of Ruth. And what we're reminded of, though, in 1 John 3:16, is that by this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay our lives down for our brothers. To say it another way, Chisholm again says this: people may experience tragedy and feel rejected by God, but followers of Christ should reach out to them in sacrificial love, even though such love may seem risky and unappreciated. So as we kind of finish out this book and this chapter, I want to kind of share some truths that I found as I studied. First thing I want to share with you is that even though when we don't see it, God is still there, right? We kind of touched on this a bit earlier. When we don't see it, God is still at work. This is really, I think, something all Americans need to hear, right? This is something that's really, really big. Think about how God, as we go through the entire story of Ruth, we see that God turned a bitter woman back to being a delightful woman, right? God can do that. And he can do that with us as well. Another thing that we see, the second truth I want to share is, and it's sprinkled throughout, is that God answers prayers. And we see that sprinkled. It's kind of subtle, but you have to kind of find them and look for them. But we see several examples of this in this book. You know, we see this with Naomi and her daughters. When she blesses her daughters and speaks to them, she's actually, in a way, she's praying for them and she's praying over them. We also, of course, see this with Naomi and Ruth and just those two. We see that with Boaz and Ruth. Boaz actually tried to bless Ruth and Naomi several times in the story. And of course, we see that with the redemption part and the redemption connection here as well. So God answers prayers. The next thing we see is God is sovereign. God is in charge. God is in control. Throughout this entire book, what we see is the interplay of God's purpose and human decisions, right? It's not it's not one or the other, right? And that was the summary that I saw somebody put it. And again, the simple way of stating that is this: God is always at work, even when we don't see it. Then finally, we see that sacrificial relationships are rewarded. Sacrificial relationships are rewarded. Earlier, we determined that settling for superficial relationships will never be a substitute for sacrificial relationships. If you really think about it, Ruth had no idea what lied ahead of her when she went back with Naomi. When you really look at that, she revealed that she was willing to follow her, right? Based on the conversation we see of her having that conversation on the way from Moab, there's no indication that Ruth expected to find a husband, nor that there was an indication that that was what she was desiring. She went for the purpose of her love for Naomi. And for that she was rewarded. And Naomi was rewarded. And so was Boaz. So settling for sacrificial relationships, what ends up happening is you end up like Orpah, right? It's going to be good for a while, but when things are uncomfortable, then you're going to leave and go back to your old ways. In a way, these types of relationships are really much like the relationships that we have with Christ and God through Christ. So I have a couple questions. Are we sacrificing our time for these sacrificial relationships? Are we sacrificing our time? The other day I'm putting this sermon together, and Gabrielle was crying her face off in the other room. And there was just nothing, right? She was just angry and mad. And so I'm like, okay, I can't focus anyway. So I put my stuff down and I decided to go over there. I spent maybe 15, 20 minutes just sitting with her, right? All she needed was attention. She needed love. And it cost me only 15, 20 minutes of my day, right? And are we doing that with our loved ones? Are we doing that with our friends and those who need us? Are we sacrificing resources for those and for these sacrificial relationships? When our family was quarantined last couple of weeks, we had so many people reach out to us. They brought food, groceries, games, right? Things that we needed to keep ourselves occupied during that time. Almost daily, how are you feeling? Do you need anything? Right? And that's such a blessing to know that there are people in my life and in the life of my family that we can count on. We even had friends from New York send us dinner. Right? And I think that's just an amazing way of sacrificing even your resources. Again, maybe it's $30, $10, but it's something and it's meaningful and it's appreciated. And that's really the issue in our culture today is there's so many relationships that are superficial, right? I think the easiest way to see that is your social media following, right? Oh, I have so many friends. No, those aren't friends, right? Those maybe are different than that. But then maybe they are friends, but in a superficial way, not so much as sacrificial, right? There's no connection. There's nothing real about that. So really, how much do you really know about your friends? How much do you know about your family, right? What do they struggle with? What are some things that cause them pain and hurt and distress? In what ways can you minister to them? In what ways can you show them that you care? In what ways can you show them that you love them? Give you a couple examples. Talk to them. Find out what's going on in their lives. And this goes on both sides, but also to be vulnerable. A lot of us are afraid to talk about our problems because, I think for men it's because it makes us feel weak, right? And it's not a weakness. I think that's a strength. When you're able to speak to somebody from your heart, I think there's a power involved in that. So we have to be vulnerable, so that way our relationships are more sacrificial than they are superficial. And again, these are two very simple examples, and there are definitely many more. I've heard that in life, there's really you only have a small handful of friends, right? Just a small handful of people that are true friends in your life. Many others are simply acquaintances. So are you going to be a true friend to somebody? Or are you going to simply be an acquaintance? Let's pray. Father, help us to live sacrificially, to build our relationships, find relationships, rekindle relationships that are sacrificial and not superficial on the surface. I think now more than any time in our country, we need people who we can count on, who we can love, who we can communicate to and speak to. I know many people are feeling hurt. Many people are feeling isolated. And those are the times where we need these individuals that you place in our lives. And you put these individuals in our lives so that we're not alone and we don't feel alone. And more than that, Lord, help us to feel your presence. Help us to feel your presence in our lives. Help us to understand and have that faith that's needed to trust that you're in control, fully in control each and every time. And help those of us who are struggling with finding those real sacrificial relationships. Help us to see that first in you and then bring others into our lives that can help us with that as well. We just want to love like Christ loved, Lord. So help us to do that. In Jesus' name.